Imagine being betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most. Not by enemies, not by strangers, by your own brothers. Thrown into a pit, sold like cattle, falsely accused, forgotten in a dungeon. And yet somehow, against every odd, rising to become the second most powerful man on earth. This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of Joseph, a young man whose life was torn apart at every turn, yet whose dreams refused to die. A story about jealousy so deep it turns family into enemies. About injustice that would break most people. And about a resilience so extraordinary it changed the course of history. But perhaps what makes Joseph's story truly unforgettable is this. Every single thing that seemed like a disaster was quietly being woven into something greater. A story that asks us, what if your worst moments are actually setting you up for your greatest purpose? This is the story of Joseph, the dreamer who saved the world. Our story begins in the land of Canaan, roughly 1900 BCE, in the large and complicated household of a man named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, but everyone knew that Joseph, the 11th born, was different. He was the son of Rachel, the wife Jacob had loved most deeply, and that love spilled over onto Joseph in ways that would prove dangerous. Jacob gave Joseph something no other son received: a richly ornamented robe. History has called it the coat of many colors. Whatever its exact design, its meaning was unmistakable. This was the robe of a firstborn, of an heir, of a favorite. And Joseph's brothers were reminded of it every single day. The jealousy simmering in that household was quiet at first. But Joseph, young and unaware of how deeply his brothers resented him, made it worse. He began sharing his dreams, vivid, recurring dreams in which his brothers bowed down to him. In one, their sheaves of grain circled and prostrated themselves before his. In another, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all knelt at his feet. His brother's resentment hardened into something darker. His father was troubled, and the household that should have been Joseph's safe place became a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The spark came on an ordinary day. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were grazing flocks near Dothan. Joseph set off across the desert in his coat, carrying his father's trust, completely unaware of what was waiting for him. They spotted him from far away. Something dark moved through the group. By the time Joseph reached them, the decision had been made. They seized him, tore the coat from his back, and threw him into an empty cistern, a dry pit with no water and no way out. Then they sat down to eat their meal. The casual cruelty of that moment is almost incomprehensible. Their brother cried out from the pit below, while they passed bread between them. When a caravan of traders appeared on the horizon heading toward Egypt, the brothers saw an opportunity. They pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver, the price of a common slave. Joseph was taken away in chains, 17 years old, looking back at his brothers growing smaller in the desert heat. The coat was taken, dipped in goat's blood, and carried back to their father as false evidence of a terrible death. Jacob's grief was absolute. He tore his own clothes, dressed himself in sackcloth, and refused every attempt at comfort. He said he would mourn his son until his own dying day. Meanwhile, far to the south, the caravan carried Joseph deeper into Egypt, into a world he had never seen, among people whose language he did not speak, toward a future he could not imagine. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's senior officials and captain of the royal guard. He had gone from beloved son to foreign slave in the space of days. But something extraordinary began happening. Whatever Joseph put his hand to succeeded. His judgment was sound, his work impeccable, and his character visible to everyone around him. Potiphar noticed, promoted him, and eventually handed him the running of his entire household. The slave from Canaan was now managing one of the most important estates in Egypt. He had lost his coat, his family, his freedom, and his homeland. But he had not lost his integrity. Then came the crisis that would cost him everything he had rebuilt. Potiphar's wife began pursuing Joseph relentlessly, and Joseph refused her day after day, on the grounds that betraying his master's trust would be a sin against God. When she finally cornered him alone and grabbed his cloak, he fled, leaving the cloak in her hands. She used it against him. When Potiphar returned home, she presented the cloak as evidence of an assault Joseph had never committed. Potiphar's fury was swift and absolute. Joseph was stripped of everything once again and thrown into the royal prison. He had done everything right. His reward was a dungeon. Even in prison, the pattern continued. The warden recognized Joseph's character and placed him in charge of the other inmates. Joseph, the man who had run a household, now ran a prison. Circumstances changed, character did not. Two significant prisoners arrived, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker, both troubled by vivid dreams they could not understand. Joseph listened to each one carefully and interpreted them with calm clarity. The cupbearer would be restored to his position within 3 days. The baker would be executed in the same time. Both happened exactly as Joseph said. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph made one quiet request, that he be remembered before Pharaoh, that his case be mentioned, that someone speak up for a man who had been taken from his home and thrown into a dungeon for something he never did. The cupbearer was restored, and Joseph was forgotten. 2 full years of silence followed. The man with the gift of dreams sat in a dungeon, waiting for a door that would not open. Then Pharaoh himself dreamed. 7 fat, healthy cows devoured by 7 gaunt, wasted ones. 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 scorched and withered ones. He woke before dawn, deeply shaken, and summoned every wise man in Egypt. Not one of them could explain what he had seen. It was then that the cupbearer's memory finally stirred. He told Pharaoh about the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted his dream with perfect accuracy 2 years before. Joseph was pulled from the dungeon that same morning. He was shaved, given clean clothes, and brought before the most powerful ruler on earth, a man who had been sleeping in a prison cell just hours before, now standing in the throne room of Egypt. Joseph listened to both dreams and spoke without hesitation. 7 years of extraordinary abundance were coming to Egypt. 7 years of devastating famine would follow, so severe they would erase all memory of the good years. The dream had come twice because the matter was decided. It would happen soon. Then Joseph went further. He told Pharaoh exactly what to do. Appoint a wise administrator. Store 1/5 of every harvest during the good years. Build reserves that would carry the nation through what was coming. Pharaoh looked at the man before him, a foreigner, a former prisoner, and made a decision that would change both their lives. He placed his own signet ring on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen and hung a gold chain around his neck. He gave him a royal chariot and declared that no one in all of Egypt would move without Joseph's approval. Joseph was 30 years old. 13 years of slavery and prison had ended in a single morning. He was now the second most powerful man in the world. For 7 years, Joseph traveled the length of Egypt, overseeing the collection and storage of grain in every city. The reserves grew beyond measuring. He married and had 2 sons, Manasseh, meaning God had made him forget his suffering, and Ephraim, meaning God had made him fruitful in the land of his pain. Even at the height of his power, his past was written into his children's names. Then the abundance ended. The famine arrived, not just in Egypt, but across the entire ancient world. Nations flooded in from every direction, desperate for food. Pharaoh's answer to all of them was the same: go to Joseph. Among the desperate crowds making the long journey south were 10 travel-worn men in shepherd's cloaks from the land of Canaan. They had no idea who the great official was who held the fate of nations in his hands. But Joseph would know them the moment they walked through the door. When Joseph's brothers entered the hall and bowed low before him, the memory of his dreams struck him like a physical blow. The sheaves bowing down, the stars kneeling. And here they were, his brothers, faces to the ground, 22 years older, with no idea who sat before them. Joseph kept his composure and his identity hidden. He questioned them harshly, accused them of being spies, held Simeon as collateral, and sent the rest back to Canaan with a condition. They must return with their youngest brother to prove their story. The brothers left, shaken and confused. Jacob's response when they arrived home was anguished. He had already lost Joseph. Simeon was being held in Egypt, and now they wanted Benjamin too. Only when the grain ran out completely did Jacob relent. He sent his sons back, this time with Benjamin, with gifts, with twice the silver. When Joseph saw Benjamin, his own mother's son, something inside him cracked. He excused himself and wept alone before composing himself to return. He feasted with his brothers that evening, seating them in precise birth order, a detail that left them astonished and unnerved. The next morning, he sent them away with full sacks, but he had hidden his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. His steward caught them before they cleared the city. The cup was found. The brothers tore their clothes in despair and returned. Joseph told them calmly that Benjamin would remain as his slave. The rest were free to leave. It was then that Judah stepped forward. The same Judah who had suggested selling Joseph for silver now offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. He described their father's grief, the promise he had made to bring Benjamin home safely, and said he could not bear to watch what his father's face would look like if Benjamin did not return. Joseph could not hold himself together any longer. He cleared the room of every attendant, and then, alone with his brothers for the first time in 22 years, he wept, so deeply that the sound carried through the palace walls. When he could speak, he looked at the men before him and said the words that collapsed 2 decades of pain into a single moment.
I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?
His brothers could not answer. They stood frozen, terrified of the man who held the power of life and death over their entire family. Joseph told them to come closer. And then, rather than the judgment they deserved and feared, he offered something they had no right to expect.
Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you.
He embraced Benjamin and wept. He embraced every one of his brothers. The most powerful official in Egypt weeping over the men who had sold him for the price of a slave. Joseph sent his brothers back to Canaan loaded with provisions, wagons, and gifts. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive and ruler of Egypt, his heart went numb. It was too enormous to believe. But when he saw the wagons, something in him revived. He rose and made the journey south. The reunion in Goshen was a long, wordless embrace. An old man holding the son he had mourned for 22 years. All of Jacob's family, 70 people in total, settled in the best land Egypt had to offer, provided by Pharaoh himself. Years later, when Jacob died, Joseph's brothers feared the grace they had received would finally expire. They sent word begging forgiveness, braced for the retribution they had spent decades expecting. Joseph wept when he heard it. And his answer is perhaps the most extraordinary statement in the entire story.
You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.
He reassured them. He provided for them. He chose, again, mercy over justice. Joseph lived to the age of 110. He saw 3 generations of his descendants grow up around him. And before he died, he made his family swear one final oath. When God eventually led them out of Egypt, they must carry his bones with them back to the land of promise. Centuries later, when Moses led the great exodus out of Egypt, he honored that oath. The dreamer made his last journey home long after his death. The story of Joseph speaks with striking directness to experiences most of us know. The sting of betrayal by people who should have loved us. The frustration of doing everything right and still losing. The long silence of waiting in a place that feels like a pit with no visible exit. What makes Joseph extraordinary is not that he avoided those experiences. It is what he carried through them. An integrity that no circumstance could strip away, and a willingness at the end of it all to reframe 22 years of suffering not as wasted time, but as preparation for a purpose larger than himself. We may not be thrown into pits or forgotten in dungeons, but most of us know what it is to wait in a place we did not choose. Joseph's story asks us to consider, what if the pit is not the end? What if the waiting is not wasted? What is your pit moment? The hardest season that later made sense? Share it in the comments. I read every single one. If Joseph's story moved you today, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that have shaped our world and hit the bell so you never miss one. Thanks for watching.